All right, and we are off. So, welcome everyone. This is Tips for Energy Healing number 5. And I started doing this just to try to encapsulate some of the information and guidance and learning and experience I've gotten doing like 27 billion hours of healing private sessions over the last 20 years. And this will be recorded and posted to YouTube along with a little PDF guide. And our topic for tonight is to help you, especially with digging on trauma. And a lot of the answer is right there in the title. It's called The First or the Worst. And so for some things you're digging on, it's pretty clear that, okay, I got diagnosed with cancer on this day, right? I was in a car accident on this day. It was this day that my father died. It was this day I lost my job or went bankrupt or insert life tragedy here. So when there's big, obvious things to work on, it's pretty clear where to go, right? We showed you a lot of the tricks in level 1 and level 2, finding the timeline, what'll change in life, all that. This tip today is really designed for situations where there's a lot of little stuff, but not one big obvious one. So for example, let's say that you're having terrible luck in love and you've had, 10 or 15 or 20 boyfriends, girlfriends, sheep friends, whatever you're into. And you seem to have a pattern of difficult breakups or lack of intimacy or insert issue here, right? But there's not a clear-cut one big disaster or clear-cut trauma. It's more lots of little ones. So what do we do with that? So one of the things that would work is you could go run and do digging and trauma clearing on every breakup you've had in this example, right? And that'll work, but that takes a long time. And it's kind of boring. And we're not really into that here, are we? We don't want to take a long time unless we have to. And we'd rather keep it fresh and exciting and challenging rather than just be bored as we grind through the same clearings 35 times. So one of the guidelines that I learned from Terry, and I've also heard this from other teachers as well as more traditional psychologists. So it is called the first or the worst. And the idea is that if you've had 35 breakups, you don't need to go and do necessarily 35 relationship clearings and 35 trauma clearings and 35 soul retrievals. You can. That'll probably work. But again, that's going to take a long time and be really boring. Our goal is to find the 1 or 2 or 3 that are really rooting that holds it all together. You guys may remember one of the metaphors Terry really liked was the house of cards. That all our beliefs and traumas and dysfunction and trapped emotions are lined up inside of us, kind of like a house of cards. And there's a couple ways you can take down the house of cards. You could pull one card off the time from the top, and that will work. Eventually, the house of cards will come down. But there's a much easier way. If you can find the one at the bottom that everything else is anchored to and pull it out, the whole thing collapses on its own. And that's kind of what we try to do with the digging. That's why we go right after the biggest, the nastiest, the scariest. Go there first. But sometimes it's not clear. So if you have a situation where there's lots of little things, your guideline is the first or the worst. And it doesn't really matter which one. And just like with digging, it doesn't really matter. You may have 7 weeds that come out through the surface on the ground that are actually all just sprouting off of one big weed underground, right? So don't stress too much. But you would say, okay, if you're not sure which one is the one to dig on, if you're not sure, blah, 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 either go with the first or the worst. And so the first would be whatever they first remember. Because one of the many things clients will do is you'll say, well, what's the first one? Oh, I can't possibly remember that. Don't ask me that. It's like, okay, that's okay. Whatever the first one they remember is good enough. So that would be the first. So if you're not sure, just go with the first one they remember. That's usually a good choice. The other is the worst. If there was one that you thought was worse than the others, doesn't matter if it was last week or last month or 50 years ago, that one will often lead you to the bottom. And sometimes they're the same thing. But I would say most of the time, if the first is the worst, then that kind of falls into the category of it's obvious which one to go after, right? Exactly. This is for when there's a lot of little stuff rather than one big obvious thing. I remember one of the things I got really traumatized by growing up was allergy shots. I had to go and get allergy shots twice a week for, God, must have been at least 5 years. And that sucked. And there's not necessarily one specific thing that I got traumatized by. But by the time I was a teenager, I had collapsing veins, a big fear of needles, all that stuff, right? But there wasn't one obvious incident. So that would be an example. I had what, 800 allergy shots over the years. You don't want to run 800 trauma clearings. That would be boring and take a long time. So either pick the worst one if there was one that was particularly bad. So I would lean towards that, right? If there's one that's clearly the worst, dig on that. If not, just go with the first one you remember and let it be that simple. Make sense? Cool. Let me turn off the recording. So posterity, I'll see you in the future. Maybe.